Good evening again, everybody. We've still got people coming in, but I think we'll try and make a start so that we're not too late, because I have a feeling we're going to have a lot of questions at the end. Anyway, um, before I introduce David, I just want to remind everybody that tonight's talk will be being recorded, is being recorded. Can you all make sure that you keep your microphones and your video off, please? They should be muted automatically, but I notice that every so often some people are unmuting themselves. So make sure that you stay quiet. You can put your questions to David, any that you want to ask, using the chat function, and I'll put them then to David at the end. Right, without any further ado, it gives me great pleasure to be able to introduce David Breeze. I should be saying it's about time, really, David. We should have had you on before. I know David needs very little introduction, and to give him all his credits would probably take me about 10 minutes, so I'm not going to do that. So he goes without saying. I think you're Professor Emeritus at 4 universities, is it now, David? Which in itself is quite an achievement. But for me, the most important thing was that he led the team that resulted in the Antonine Wall becoming a World Heritage Site back in, check my notes, 2008. Seems like yesterday. Time flies. But this evening, he's going to be talking about things a little bit north of the wall, with Agricola's final campaign and the logistics of how he actually got there, something that's I'm really looking forward to. And I think finally, I'll stop prattling on. The numbers in the waiting room seem to be going down. So we'll make a start. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to you if you want to start sharing your screen, David.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, David.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much for the introduction. This is a topic which has long interested me. We are familiar. Wait a minute. We are familiar with the Agricola, written by Tacitus, his son-in-law. We always have to be careful with the book. Just think of anything written by a member of the family about the head of the family, in this case, Agricola. We just have to be careful as to how much of it we trust. But it can't all be made up, of course, and we have other evidence in the book itself. But in the book, in relationship to the final campaign, for the first time, Tacitus said that the army marched light. So part of what's interested me about this campaign is precisely what did this mean? Before we launch into the Agricola, I should like to emphasize that there are other accounts of Roman campaigning, the most famous being Caesar's Gallic War. And if you haven't read it or haven't read it in a long time, I would encourage you to read it again. It's hagiographical about himself in this case, but it's the throwaway comments that I find interesting, like him varying his march or hastening his march in order to get to the place where he'd sent in advance for food to be available for his army as they cross Gaul. There are things like that which are very helpful, and how he gathered intelligence from a variety of sources during his campaigning in Gaul. One can just read it with an eye on these aspects, and you understand the Roman army rather better, I would like to suggest. Of course, we have other sources as Trajan's column in Rome, which I'll be using quite a lot, which record the campaigns of the Emperor Trajan in what is now Romania, and in particular that part known as Transylvania. Again, there's some, in this case, some artistic license at play in the depiction of soldiers. And we have archaeology. Now, this is a map that the best we can produce. I created it a few years ago, showing all the camps which are likely to date to the time of Agricola. And you can see they're heading up into northeast Scotland, indicating the route that Agricola took, bypassing the Highlands. It's always interesting when one's trying to work out what Roman attitudes were to the Highlands. My old friend George Joby had a very simple view. He said, well, there's no settlements up there, so what would the Roman army do with bothering with the Highlands of Scotland? But they can be bypassed, as clearly Agricola did. So let's start off and we look at the army that Agricola had. This is Trajan's column. The legions, in this case, are marching out over a bridge of boats, as you can see, leading looks like a town or perhaps a fortress, the gate to the left. They're at ease, if you like. They're carrying, they're not wearing their helmets, they're carrying them over their shoulder, as the man almost at the far left is depicting. And over their shoulder, they've got a pole with various items hanging from it. They're led by an officer, and the standards of the legion, the eagle, and the standards of the various constituent parts. Here we see a little more closely what the soldiers are carrying over their shoulder: a mess tin, a string bag, patera, another bag, and so on. We are, incidentally, before I forget, we have evidence as to what the soldiers should carry. Josephus is quite explicit, including these items and also a piece of rope, which we'll see later. What's not in here, I'm afraid to say, is a field marshal's baton. Here at the head is our officer, and the standards, as I've just remarked in detail, the standard of the legion to the right, a boar, it looks like, the eagle, of course, carried by the aquilifer. I'm sure you'll remember the aquilifer of a legion jumping into the seas as Caesar invaded southern England in one of his two campaigns, and the soldiers had to follow him, so they didn't have the indignity of losing their eagle. The other main body of troops, and important in relationship to this campaign, the auxiliaries. This is a scene of fighting in Dacia. The center left is the auxiliary soldier. His spear's gone. It would have been in metal. You can see him thrusting down at a Dacian cowering below him, kneeling almost, with his curved sword, I beg your pardon, and a dead Dacian below him. The shield in this case is oval, as opposed to the legionaries' rectangular shield, and his armor is mail, not the lorica segmentata of the legions. But the army is made up of a lot of groups of different groups of soldiers. Here's a slinger with his shot in his sling, and immediately behind him is a man who's just about to throw a stone ball. So we have really quite a range of weapons at play here. You can see the slinger has a whole, right in the center, has a whole range of slingshot in his cloak. And of course, these are deadly accurate through practice. So well worth having. Just think in terms of David and Goliath. And cavalry. Now, the legions were practically all, there was only 120 cavalry in a legion. The cavalry came from originally allies, and in particular Gallic allies. And here we have a couple of horsemen. These are again in chainmail. They've got helmets on, and you can see the shield, the guard at the back, the neck guard at the back in both cases. And they are equipped with a rather longer sword than the infantry because, of course, they have further to lunge at their opponents. One of the other groups that features in the account of Agricola's campaign is the navy. The Romans had several navies, in fact. They were quartered around the empire. The most famous ones were Misenum and Ravenna on each side of Italy, but there was a British fleet based at Boulogne. Their main duties related to supplying, it would appear, as we'll see in a moment, but they were also obviously employed as fighting ships. And just think back to the battle between Cleopatra and Octavian, which was a battle of sea powers, just as much later Constantine's son Crispus had a famous battle in the same sort of area in the Eastern Mediterranean. So the fleets were there over the centuries. So what can we say about Agricola's army? Well, we have information from Agricola, which we can put together. It appears he had 8,000 auxiliary infantry. He had 5,000 auxiliary cavalry and possibly 8,000 legionaries. One of the most remarkable things, in my view, about the campaign is that we know very clearly from other evidence that some of the troops that were in the army of Britain were actually fighting in the absolutely contemporary wars ordered by the Emperor Domitian in Germany. So he didn't actually have a full complement of legionaries to draw on. We're perhaps looking at 2,000 legionaries out of 5,000 in each legion. And of these 5,000, you can imagine there are quite a few sick. They're on headquarters duties. They're serving on the governor's staff in London and so on. So he only has about 2,000 legionaries from each 5,000 strong legion. One of the first actions is for any army, Roman army, is to gain the support of the gods. Our world is not that different if you think of church parades and services of thanksgiving after fighting. Well, this is a bridge distance slab. It was erected as part of the recording of the building of the Antonine Wall in Scotland in, let's say, 142 AD. And at one side, what we have is a scene of sacrifice. This is being conducted by the Second Augusta Legion, whose name is on the flag right at the very top. And presumably the man pouring the libation was the legate of that legion, a man who was called Claudius Carax and came from what's now modern Turkey. Surrounded by some officers, there's a musician, bottom right. Bottom left is a man who's going to cut the throats of the three beasts who are all lined up in appropriate order. I mean, you have to get this right. If it goes wrong, you're going to start all over again because you have to get the support of the gods in the most appropriate manner. So we don't have a record of this taking place in relation to Agricola, but we can assume that something like this would have happened. So where did Agricola go? Well, we don't know where he started from in the first place. His headquarters was in London. London was the capital of the whole province, which stretched up to Scotland. And he had duties in the way of justice, for example. He was the Chief Justice for the province as well as the provincial governor. And it's clear from Tacitus that Agricola would spend the summer in the south, coming north to a particular point where his army would assemble. And it looks as though his army is going up what we would now call Deer Street to the east, from Corbridge, which was the high crossing point of the Tyne, up through Newstead on to the Firth of Forth, and another group possibly coming up from the southwest. These camps don't all relate to Agricola's final season, I hasten to add. We can't date them other than about the time of Agricola. But it looks as though there's soldiers also coming up the west side. And they coalesce somewhere around Lochlands, which is here, which is coming on the west side of Falkirk, where we have a great cluster of camps just by the lowest bridging point or staging point almost. It's what we call a nodal point, where soldiers gathered ready to move on. And we move on, we've got to come up a little bit further up the river, perhaps the Forth, and then on in a northeasterly direction, somewhere to the mount, and round that we've got a camp right at Raydykes, just north of Stonehaven, and then turning slightly west of north, heading towards the Moray Firth. So let's start after that looking at what Tacitus has to tell us about this campaign. He tells us that Agricola reconnoitred the site of the harbours with his fleet. He states that the war was pushed forward simultaneously by land and sea. Men from the infantry, cavalry, and navy were often in the same camps, sharing supplies in high spirits. He sent the fleet ahead to plunder in order to spread panic, and the army, meanwhile, marched light. There's quite a lot of information there, and it's very unfortunate we can't actually tie it into what we know in the way of camps. In fact, the only camp that we know, which is by the coast, is Dun here. And it's quite a small camp. It's not big enough for the whole army and the navy to be in. So we've got an immediate problem. And this problem is we can't put flesh on these skeleton words. We don't know where the soldiers might have met in camps. And this is not for the want of trying. This area has seen an enormous amount of aerial photography from the late 1940s onwards. And so what we're looking at mostly, but not completely, is the result of these aerial survey campaigns. So here's our first problem. Sorry, I'm going back the wrong way. So let's look at the soldiers themselves. We have quite a few sources for how much this, in the way of, in particular, food, the soldiers took with them. One case, I think, refers to 17 days' rations, but mostly it would appear that they carried with them 3 days' rations. But also, and as we saw in this depiction earlier, they carried a basket, a saw, an axe, a pick, rope, sickle and chain, cooking pot, mess tin, string bag, leather bag. We can see what the purpose of all these are. They're cutting down trees, so they need an axe. They need to cook. They've got cooking pot, mess tin. They perhaps need a string bag for forage, sickle to pinch the locals' cereal crops. But it's quite a lot. The question is, did they carry them themselves? So here we've got, also on Trajan's column, an ox cart in the center carrying barrels of wine or water or food like garum, and to the oxen's right, 2 mules pulling another cart. Tents needed to be taken, 3,000 perhaps for Agricola's army, an enormous number, and these needed to be carried on the ox carts, the mule carts, or carried by mules. And it may well be that weapons and cooking equipment were also normally placed on carts like this, or mules. So here's a mule laden. We can see there are cooking pots and pans in the saddlebag on this mule. So what we've got to differentiate between the scene at the very beginning of the soldiers marching out with their equipment over their shoulder and the reality of what might have happened on the march. Turning to the question of camp followers and marching light. Now, Caesar's army, we know, was accompanied by camp followers. He tells us this several times, and he also tells us that they should be kept outside the army camp, except when the situation got fairly serious, when they might be allowed inside. Josephus tells us that the soldiers' servants looked after the soldiers' baggage. Arrian tells us in his discussion of the line of march where all this baggage would be placed within the column. And in addition to the camp followers, which includes the soldiers' servants and slaves, and the soldiers' servants will be trained to an extent in fighting. Agricola, we know, picked up hostages as well, and they would need guarding. So whatever he started out with, it would be a larger group in his train as he marched back to the province. And he marched through a populated landscape. I mean, if you want to understand what it might have looked like, go out and look at the countryside today. It's not that different insofar as there had been cereal cultivation. Sorry, where are we? Sorry, I'll come back to that. I beg your pardon. Cereal cultivation for nearly 4,000 years by the time the Romans got here. There were families farming the land, living in small farmsteads in a not dissimilar way to much of Scotland today. There would have been more trees, perhaps, but otherwise, we have to take into account that there are these people here with their crops and their animals. Which leads us on to supplies. Now, there are only three ways the army could have their supplies. They took them with them. They were supplied by sea, which Tacitus implies in discussing the navy, or they could be gathered en route. So we have, as you've seen, I've shown you an ox cart and a mule cart behind. But the soldiers and the animals between them could only carry supplies for 10 days. At that point, that's a tipping point that if you wanted to carry more, you needed more ox carts, and that means more grazing and more supplies, and it just becomes a situation which is not sustainable. So 10 days is the limit of the army to carry its supplies with it. Caesar, as I've already mentioned, had his men out gathering supplies in from his allies so that he could meet them in a town and feed his soldiers. We have no idea whether there were friendly tribes in southern and eastern Scotland who would perform the same service. Absolutely no evidence. So the second possibility is that supplies came by sea. Here we actually have tents being transported on the River Danube. It doesn't really matter where the depiction is. It is a reminder that the Navy could bring in supplies by sea. But we come back to the problem we've just touched on. We don't have a reasonably sized marching camps where it's possible that the soldiers could of the army could camp, and where the soldiers of the navy could offload their supplies. So we have a problem with that. It's obviously a possibility, but we don't have the evidence to support it. So the third element is taking food off the land as you march through it. This is what armies have done over all the centuries. And again, we have an example from Caesar during his invasion of Britain. He sent soldiers out to bring in the crops from the neighboring fields, and they were attacked by the Britons. This is, again, in Transylvania. It is absolutely possible that this is what happened in Britain, that the soldiers went into the fields to gain their own supplies. I like this map. The original one is by Gordon Child, and in about 1984, I think, a colleague and I updated it. The intention is to show where most people lived in Scotland at the time. When we want to think in terms of where you're going to gain food in, you've got to have people to grow food. So if you're coming up the East Coast, you're okay there. Lots of people live there. East Lothian still has hardly any visible archaeological remains because the farmland's so good, they're ploughed flat. And the same is true of Buchan up here. You don't get many upstanding prehistoric sites because of the richness of the land has led to ploughing over centuries. So we can see the areas where Agricola would be, and this complements what we know from the location of the camps, not in the Highlands. Now, having said that, I mentioned about cereal cultivation. This is a fragment of wheat. The earliest known cereal cultivation in Scotland is 4,000 years before the Romans ever got here. And when we look at this, it comes from this area of Aberdeenshire, that our earliest evidence. So we know that people up in the area where Agricola is campaigning grew cereals. The speed of march is interesting. One tends to think in terms of how far a soldier can march in a day. And of course, there are plentiful supplies of information on how the Roman Postal Service worked and how quickly, in one case, Tiberius, a member of the imperial family, could get from Rome to the Rhine in a relatively short time. But we're not talking like that. We're looking at how ordinary soldiers marched. But they can only march as anybody who takes out walking groups at the pace of the slowest. So mules are hardy, obviously. They can work for 8 hours a day. Oxen, however, can only work for a maximum of 5 hours, and they require a break of 2 hours at midday. They can travel at 3 kilometers on an hour on a level road, perhaps up to 15 kilometers a day. Two of the most interesting books on the movement of armies are about the Zulu War and the Boer War, because they were both fought in days absolutely the same as the Roman army, using mules, oxen, and with all their concomitant problems. If you think of oxen carts, they'll soon grind into the soft earth, and you end up with tracks which are many meters wide as the back of the the march tries to avoid the deep ruts. So 15 kilometers must be a maximum, certainly when we're thinking in terms of the back part of the train. So when we think about, let's say, 15 kilometers as a maximum walking distance, what's interesting when we look at the distribution of camps, I mean, we're probably missing some here, but some are quite close together. And if you think in terms of the whole of the army, it's almost as if when the front part, the vanguard, got to the next camp, the back, the rear guard was only just leaving the camp they'd occupied for the few nights before. When they got to the camp, this is Durno, which is where St. Joseph thinks that Agricola's army camped preparatory to Mons Graupius. So there we are, it's defended by a bank and ditch. Again, if you read the Zulu War, if you watch the film Zulu, one of the interesting issues at the very beginning is the attack on the camp, the British camp, and it's partly successful because Chelmsford started his march late in the season because he couldn't acquire as many horses and oxen as he would have liked. It took him a long time to get them. So he started late and he failed to protect his camp properly, which helped the Zulus attack and overcome it. So protecting your camp is really important. And we have two accounts of how camps are laid out. I'm not going to go into this. The whole point of a plan like this is when the main army arrived behind the surveyors who laid out the corners of the camp and the position of the legions with flags, they knew exactly where to go and what to do because they had been trained in these activities and knew what the plan was. Trajan's column is interesting in this context. We've got here the army marching in two columns. The Agricola states that in the final season, Agricola divided his army into three. This was not a good plan, perhaps, though others followed it, because the Ninth Legion was attacked in its camp at night and only survived by one of the other, or possibly both, the other groups of troops coming to save them. So you divide your force and you might find yourself in difficulty if your opponents had a substantial force in the field against you. But in this, what we've got is in the top, we've got the Legionaries. You can see their oblong shields. They're marching towards their camp behind an officer at the right. And below, we've got a whole group of different soldiers. At the front are archers. They're dressed as Syrian archers. And then we've got men who are just wearing breeks, carrying a shield, a dagger, or a sword. And these are perhaps the slingers and stone throwers, which we saw earlier. But we're looking at two columns coming towards a camp. And at the camp, as you can see top right, the soldiers had already arrived. The tents were being unloaded. Bottom right, a soldier had even come out of the gate to pick up some water from the stream. As the lower group of soldiers on the march came up to the entrance of the camp. And you can see it, they're the first to arrive because but at the right, they've got the eagle with them. And the cornican here is about to blow his trumpet, presumably to signal halt or disperse and go about your duties. So the next task is unloading. Here we see, sorry, it's not a good slide this perhaps, but we're unloading top left. We've already got to the right, we've got the officers' tents pitched. And again here, we've got a woodland to the right. And right in the middle, we've got the defences of the camp here with a clavicular form of gate protecting the camp. And again, the officers' tents inside. So back to this map. One of our questions when we're looking at a map like this is to ask ourselves, okay, well, we don't know where we start, but seriously, we know we're starting on the 4th, because southern Scotland, by the final campaign, had already been conquered. There may have been forts built there. We can't be sure. I mean, we're talking about just a year or two. Archaeology won't separate that for us. And so we're marching up here, and we how many camps can we count? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, perhaps. You know, these are only roughly a maximum of 15 kilometers apart. So let's say there are 10, 150 kilometers we march from base up to northeast Scotland. So it's very possible, in fact, very likely, that each camp was occupied for more than a single night. There's a really interesting Byzantine source which says the army should not occupy a camp for longer than 3 nights, by which time the local grazing would have been exploited, the forage would have been exhausted, and the water supply fouled. You think of all these horses and oxen and mules. Gosh, you can well believe that. So you're there about 3 nights, and then you're moving forward again, and that makes better sense of the amount of time that it took to move forward up to the crucial scene, which is the Battle of Mons Graupius. This is just to remind us that the soldiers would have been going out foraging locally. We can be certain of that. They had no compunction about pinching somebody's wheat. They would be getting rid of trees which might be in the way within the camp, as you see here, using the axe, which we've seen earlier. And if any of the locals got a bit uppity, they send out a party with to burn down the local houses, such as we see here, top right. We know from one account in the Agricola that on one night the camp of the 9th Legion was attacked. And if this had been successful, we would have had an entirely different view of Agricola. He would have lost. He would have been disgraced. He would have been recalled home. We'd never have even heard of him at all. But he was successful. He brought up reinforcements and threw off throughout the barbarians, and then proceeded to the Battle of Mons Graupius. One of our problems with most accounts of Roman generals is what we call topi, set statements of what they did. So here on the march, leading up to Mons Graupius, we're told that Agricola reconnoitered forests personally. Do we actually believe this? I don't think I can really with all confidence believe that he set out and to reconnoiter forest personally. He had meant to do that for him. After Mons Graupius, we're told marshes and forests covered the retreating army, i.e. the Caledonian army. And then 130 years later, the Emperor Septimius Severus had trouble cutting down forests and filling in swamps. And these go, the existence of the marshes and forests take us right the way through any literary comments about armies on the march in Britain. And I can't help feeling that in many ways what we're looking at are set phrases. The good governor does this. He reconnoites and chooses the sites of his camps and his forts himself. Helpful, I think. So it's really difficult here to know exactly what the landscape was like. But when we're considering that it had been farmed even in northeast Scotland for 4,000 years before Agricola looked at it, I think we should consider that the forest cover would not be so great that the forests were a problem, and the forest cover was probably about the same as today, which is 10% of the landscape. But it's just another problem we have to work around in trying to determine what actually happened these 1900 plus years ago. I'm sorry about this again, because what I want to do is just look at where Mons Graupius took place. And if I can find the pointer, here's Logidurno, and this is where St. Joseph argued that the fighting took place, because the great hill in front of it, and this is where the Caledonians, he argued, gathered. Here we go, on the slopes here, with the Roman army camped actually at the other side of two streams, which rather surprisingly don't occur at all in the account of the battle. The marching camps on the wrong side of the stream from the battle site. But putting that on one side, neither can we be assured that this is the actual site of the battle, and indeed disputes rage still about whether it took place here or much further south or even further north. As my professor said, if I had to go into the witness box and offer you a suggestion, it would be somewhere in the region of Culloden for the same reason. A local army, Caledonian army, army of clans, if they were going to fight, they had to stop before they got to Inverness, because at that point, they would divide into three. One group would head up along the coast towards Caithness and Sutherland. One would go westwards towards the west coast and the Highlands, and the other would go down the glen towards Argyll. So that's the last place you can actually, if you were a Caledonian, have your battle. Whether it was here, I don't know. What we do know is Agricola sent the auxiliaries, who were the black oblongs, into battle first. They got surrounded. So he sent cavalry in to hit the Caledonians on the flanks. And we're not told that the legions did anything to help, particularly in the fighting. So as Tacitus strangely put it, Roman blood, i.e. the legionaries who were Roman citizens, Roman blood was saved, and an implication at least that the auxiliaries were used for the first time to achieve this. That's not true. We know that this occurred in battles in the use of auxiliaries to take the brunt of the fighting in earlier battles over the previous decade or so. Anyway, I'm not here particularly to talk about Mons Graupius, but I can't avoid it while we're talking about his campaign. So that's a battle. It starts with an outmoded system of attack using chariots rampaging in front of the Roman army. As I said, the infantry moved up the hill. The sheer weight of numbers of the Caledonians started to surround them. So Agricola sent his cavalry in. Here's the auxiliaries fighting. Again, he's lost his spear. He's using a shield as his a weapon against his opponent. And here again, we're absolutely center. The leader in this case, just to show you what might happen, is using his shield as a weapon against his opponent. And at the top, well, again, we've got the cavalry used to charge the, in this case, Dacian infantrymen. We're told now that Agricola marched slowly back, collecting hostages on the way. We're not told where he went, so I'm going to fly a kite for you. This is a modern creation of Ptolemy's map. Ptolemy didn't draw a map of North Britain or any part either. What he did do was he provided the coordinates for his sites. So right at the bottom, we've got the Forth here, we've got the Tay, we've got above it northeast Scotland, Varar estuary. Here is the Bewley Firth, and coming down at a slight angle here are a couple of sites which we cannot place. But the angle is that of the River Spey. And I simply wonder whether Agricola didn't go back the way he came, but he actually marched his troops through the Highlands, which is why we know of these sites in the Highlands. And I want to draw your attention to the difference between the east of the Great Glen. This is where where Caledonia is written. East of the Great Glen, where we've got a lot of place names, and to the west, where we only have tribal names, no place names. So it would appear to me that Agricola didn't get into the areas the west of the Great Glen, but the fact that we have these two place names coming down from Pinar to Castra on the coast here, we've got the two place names absolutely in the Highland area, suggests that he may have come up the Spey Valley and then back down the route taken today by the Tay and the Inverness Road, coming up from Roman Inchtuthil. I think we must draw to a close, but ask ourselves, what was his aim? I mean, at the time, he'd got himself up to here. He was well north. He was in Morayshire. He had the Romans in the last 15 years had conquered all of this. This area had been a client state, North England, which they'd taken over. So they'd expanded their military control from the sort of Mersey to the Humber here, right the way up into northeast Scotland. And I think there can be little doubt that the intention was to complete the conquest of the island. It was just that troubles elsewhere led to the withdrawal of troops from Britain, and the effort stumbled to a halt. What actually happened, and it happened after Agricola, immediately after Mons Graupius, Agricola was withdrawn, and his successor started laying down the pattern of control. He built forts along the edge of the Highlands. He started road building, coming up from Camelon here, Loughlin's camps, round over the Forth, Doon, and up as far as Stracathro, where is the most northerly Roman fort in the whole of the Roman Empire. But the question is, what was the purpose of these forts? They're frequently called glen-rocking forts. I don't like the phrase because it implies a purpose. Highland line forts tells us where they are, and it has been suggested that their purpose was not to block the glens from where we know there is nobody living, or very few people, should I say, I beg your pardon, few people. And notice how Inchtuthil, the legionary base here, right in the center, is on this main artery leading up into the Highlands, and then eventually keep going and come down to Inverness. And I think it's very possible these were springboards for the conquest of the Highlands, which never happened because one whole legion was withdrawn from Britain to deal with warfare on the Danube. Inchtuthil was abandoned. But if we want a parallel, we can look at the Hanoverian conquest, holding down of the Highlands. Their bases, Stirling down here, just upstream from Camillon, another base in Dumbarton, and the roads snake up to exactly what the Romans did everywhere else. They're big forts, Fort William, Fort Augustus, Fort George, in the main valleys, and linked back by these roads, guarded by fortlets, of which notably surviving are Riven Barracks and Corgarth. I would like to end by pointing out that, in my view, this is a plan which the Romans would have adopted if they had had the manpower, excuse me, to take over and conquer the Highlands. We're left with lots of questions. We always are. We know that the battle was fought late in the season. We know that Roman campaign started in May. So we've got May, June, July, August, 4 to 5 months. What did he do in all that time? There's more going up to Mons Graupius, wherever it was in northeast Scotland. The camps don't give us an impression that there's a great distance involved by their proximity to each other. He's perhaps stayed longer than 3 days at each one and explored the areas and looked for ways through the Highlands. We don't know. But there is a question. He's got 3 or 4 months, but the evidence of the camps is rather at odds. It could have been done much quicker. And why did he march light? What is the purpose of that? All armies collect camp followers to look after the soldiers, if nothing else. Again, there's an excellent book about the campaigns of Alexander the Great, which describe how he marched light, and he got rid of all the camp followers. Did Agricola do that? Was that his purpose? He was in his 7th campaigning season. Was he absolutely determined to bring it to a successful conclusion? So I'll leave you some with questions which we can't answer. But in the meantime, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. That was, as expected, fascinating. I'm going to move on with a couple of questions.
Yeah.
Just bear with me one sec. If anybody else thinks of anything in the next few minutes, please just put them in the chat and they'll be relayed to me. From Susan Rands. Is it possible there was a cascade system of ships bringing supplies from the south and transferring them to smaller ships that could go up the rivers to meet Agricola's army?
Susan Rands is a clever girl. Yes, that sounds pretty good to me. One of the revolutions over the last decades has been the discovery of ships in the Rhine Delta in particular, and these are flat-bottomed ships for carrying goods down the Rhine, with really enormous ones. And if any of you ever hear me give the lecture again, I'll have one of these ships in it. And thanks to Susan. They only need 3 men to propel them, but you are going upstream here. But you could have them pulled by mules or horses, I suppose. And yes, that's a good suggestion. I like it. Thank you very much indeed. It still doesn't get us around the problem where the soldiers and the sailors met in camps, but it could put the camps further upstream. Yes, we need to look at that in relationship to water flow in rivers.
I've just seen a question coming in which sort of preempts something I was going to ask, sort of. Somebody there, I'll just see the name. David S. Don't know more than that. Was asking whether the original Roman ports or landing sites could have been subsequently built over by later development.
This is very
Arista.
true. I did think of saying that. Um, I counter that by saying there has been a lot of aerial photography over that area. And although we picked up the odd camp by the road, it's very possible that we have lost some. But the intensity of aerial survey is quite significant. Having said that, I think we just have to accept that, yes,
Yeah.
there may be some hidden.
I mean, I did wonder if one of the reasons that we're not seeing the camps is simply, you alluded to it, that they've just been destroyed by agriculture. If they were
Well,
on the coast or close to the coast, could that be?
yeah, well, you if they've still been, I mean, all practically everything on that map are crop marks. They're not visible above ground. They're only available through crop marks. And people like J.K. St. Joseph and Gordon Maxwell also read the Agricola. So they know that there should be camps along the coast, and they still haven't found them.
Yeah.
I mean, the coastal plain is not actually one continuous town.
No. A couple of questions that I'm going to put together. David Ratledge says Barry Jones apparently recorded camps or forts on the Moray Firth at Forres and Cawdor. He asks, are these real? Because they would fit with Culloden.
Right. Unexpurgated view. The sites exist. Up until the time that Barry got to work on them, they were regarded as medieval. I don't know a single Roman whose view I trust accepts them as Romans. I visited excavations several times. The most famous one was Easter Galcantry. They're not in a position which you would normally find for a Roman fort. They're down the slope, they're overlooked. They are small. He didn't find any Roman pottery there. I don't believe his post holes. I could go on. I simply don't believe them. And I and my colleagues like Gordon Maxwell, Bill Hanson, Lawrence Kepi all visited, and none of us could accept that they're Roman camps. Barry saw what he wanted to believe. As simple as that. There's a question about Gatehouse of Fleet. Yes, exactly. And Irvine as well. Along the west coast, we've got camps. There's one now in Ayr. And that's interesting, isn't it? We've got camps by the sea on the west coast, but not on the east coast.
But are they necessarily of the same campaign? So
well, that's difficult. If we had a camp on the east coast, we'd probably assign it to Agricola anyway. We don't have any other camp that is I've got up my sleeve relating to a later campaign, I'm afraid.
Just bear with me. Dave Armstrong was asking, which is sort of related to what to David Ratledge's question, whether the literary and archaeological evidence suggests that Caledonia was actually subjugated, or was there still further campaigning needed in the far highlands and islands? You touched on it a little.
Yeah.
There's the idea, isn't it, that Agricola actually sailed around the top of Scotland?
Yes. Right. Just let me put my thoughts into order. What we've got in the book, the Agricola, is the success, the story of a successful general. Is a man who campaigned over 7 seasons. He inherited a terrible. This sounds very like every politician that comes in, everybody blames it on his predecessor. Here, Agricola inherited a terrible position with an uprising in Wales. He put that down. Where he went the next season, Tacitus doesn't even tell us. We don't know. We guess. And then he comes up to the Tay, and then the emperor dies. So he stops for 2 seasons doing serious campaigning north of the Tay, and then when Domitian takes over, he starts again, and his two final campaigns are right up in the north, and the whole book is leading to the success of the Battle of Mons Graupius. And he returns from that, and normally then what would happen would be a campaign of fort building to control the area. And that starts, but it's not finished. Inchtuthil is not finished. These forts were abandoned very quickly because there was trouble closer to home. But hostages were taken. What does that mean? Normally, it would mean that the subjugated people accepted that they had been beaten and they gave up hostages, and these were the Caledonian tribes. You've got to also, I take on board that Tacitus is generally talking about the people of Caledonia. So we then have his admiral sailing around Britain. He visited Orkney and sighted Thule. I have no idea what he sighted. He saw something in the distance, and that's Thule. It must be Thule because we know that's the end of the world. But what he actually saw, we have no idea.
Wow.
Everybody says, most people say it was Shetland, but we don't know that. Anyway, so in many ways, Agricola had done his job. He'd beaten the Caledonians. He sailed around the island. Tacitus says he was the first to prove that Britain was an island. Utter bunkum. Caesar knew it was an island. 100 whatever it was, 30 years before.
Susan's opened the floodgates with her boats and ships. We've got a stack of questions in here. First from Albert, our own Albert. Would it make sense for supply ships to only go as far as the tides would take them upriver? It's a question. I'm going to put all these because there's commonality.
I mean, can I just say, we can't answer this question today. Susan's put a question on the table. I don't know how many. There's more than 100 people here. Everybody can go away and look at tide times and how far upstream the sea flows. I can't answer this today. I don't have this information.
I'll just put one thing. You don't need to answer them. It's an observation from Pete Wilson.
Yeah.
In the light of the attack on the 9th Legion, could a possible alternative to Susan's suggestion be that the lack of camps on the coast reflects the soldiers and sailors meeting up at locations where the number of troops/sailors meant that a ditched camp was thought not necessary or practical due to the size of the force?
I think this is a very good point. There is, just in the outskirts of Aberdeen, we found Roman ovens, but no defences.
Wow.
Okay. So picking up Pete's point, if you're a Roman army with its usual feeling of entitlement and strength and usual victory, it may well be that you would stop and not put a rampart around your tents. The problem is we've always assumed that this is what happened, and this new site with all these ovens suggests that if you're in command of the landscape, you don't really need to protect your base.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, this is just another issue that we're going to have to grapple with.
I'm not familiar with this site, David. How many ovens have been found?
I can't remember. I'm sorry. It's and I'm trying hard to remember the name. I'll have to send it to you, and then you can forward it.
If you can't remember, Pete might, because he's always the fount of all knowledge. If you know Pete, let us know. Moving on quickly, because we've still got a few more. Make sure I'm not missing anything. Okay. Jan Scott is asking, to what extent did Caledonians ever take on any aspect of Roman culture, compared with the rest of Britain? Were they always going to be trouble as a closing statement? I think we'll take that as a yes. But
yeah, it's I think the answer is um, is yes and no. Um, all the in Europe, which I include Britain, north of beyond the frontier, rather, all the tribes, the states there accepted Roman goods. They accepted coins.
mhm.
They could hardly spend them in the local market, but they could show them off to their friends. This is, they've got a coin with the Roman emperor on. It shows you how important you are. Glass is exported into Caledonian lands and other artifacts. So the tribes around the empire, beyond the frontier, everywhere, took in Roman goods. Mostly the senior people, the chiefs, whatever you want to call them, to demonstrate their power, their links to Rome, sometimes obviously their support from Rome. And we have always to accept and understand that the Romans interfered with everything that was going on around them, just as the Americans do. We haven't forgotten that America invaded our little island of Grenada without bothering to tell Maggie Thatcher, have we? And this is what imperial powers do. There's a coin issue under Antoninus Pius, which is all about Antoninus Pius giving a king to the Quadii, who lived north of the frontier in Central Europe. They wanted to make sure that the people beyond the province were friendly. So we've got lots of coin hoards right the way up to the Moray Firth, from Roman coins, Roman goods. That's probably about as far as we can go. There's an acceptance of showing off that we got big friends in Rome. Beyond that, it's really difficult to say what the Romans did, and they did it on the continent, and they did it in Scotland. By the sheer presence of Rome, they forced the tribes beyond the province, beyond the frontier, to coalesce to a size where they could successfully defeat defeat the Romans. This is how the Franks and the other big tribes came into being from the enormous numbers of small tribes on the continent. The only way they could defeat Rome by getting together. So you end up with Ptolemy's 12 tribes have disappeared into the Caledonians and other Picts, or whatever the phrase is. So that's one way that the people beyond the empire became Roman.
From Phil Murgatroyd, we're back to camps. Is making a point, really. He's suggesting it could be possible for marching camps to be too ephemeral to survive. And he's using as an example the Manzikert campaign, which is 1,000 years later, but that was apparently 6 months, but must have involved dozens of temporary camps. And he's saying that he's not aware of any that survive.
I bow to his superior knowledge. We do know of some camps on the eastern frontier, near Jura, for example. It's surprising what shows up, though, through crop marks in Scotland.
Yes, indeed.
You only have to have. I couldn't tell you what the lowest shadow is, but it's perhaps only a foot deep, 30 centimeters deep. and it will still show up. St. Joseph found that there were um, little trenches showed up on some aerial photographs between the gates of the camps, which on excavation turned out to be Roman. They just thought they were animal burrows. So, I think it depends on the crop, obviously, time of the year you take the photographs and so on. But and obviously ploughing can be deep enough to, especially if you're ploughing for potatoes, digging deep enough to get rid of the
Yeah.
evidence. But these are pretty big camps as well. So if they were there, not all your fields would be potatoes, and the chances of picking them something up. And I come back to quite simply the intensity of over 70 or 80 years of flying over this area.
You would certainly expect to see at least one or two if there were any there. If there's going to be one, there's going to be lots. So
Yeah.
I take your point. A comment from Kevin Cook: a battle won, but a war lost. Due to taking the easy route northeast, taking the Great Glen was needed to secure that part of Scotland. A two-pronged invasion was essential to secure southern Scotland? Question mark.
Uh, to secure southern Scotland.
Yeah, that's the question.
Yeah. I mean, what we're into is
South of the Great Glen, I assume is meaning.
yeah, yeah. Yes, the point is whether we like it or not, Scotland wasn't very important to the Romans. At the time, at this immediately after Mons Graupius, first of all, the governor of the local province on the Danube was defeated in battle and died in battle. The governor. And that was followed by Domitian sending another army under the Praetorian prefect, who was similarly bloodied. And the Praetorian prefect, the commanding officer under the emperor, was killed in battle. I mean, this is serious stuff.
Yeah.
If you look at the movement of legions, Domitian moves 4 legions from the Rhine to the Danube. That's a great effort because it's not particularly affecting Italy, but it is affecting the very rich Greek East by crossing the Danube and coming through the Balkans. And once you're there, you're across the Bosphorus and so on. So this is far more important to the Romans. And that's why something like a quarter of the whole British army is pulled out. The second Adjutrix ends up in what is now Budapest. A few years later, that moves clearly is moved eastwards, and it starts immediately after Mons Graupius, which is probably 83. By 85, we think that two Adjutrix was on the continent and heading eastwards. So the issue, to characterize it as a war lost, I don't know how helpful that is. Yes, okay, the war was not crowned with the success of a permanent occupation, but that was because of the Romans rightly regarded what was happening on the Danube as more important than what was happening in our corner of the world.
I suspect Tacitus wouldn't see it that way, but he was slightly biased. We've got 3 people have let us know about the ovens.
Yeah.
David Breer, John McNeil, and Graham Stubbs, of course.
Yeah.
Apparently there were 90 of them, and it's near Aberdeen on the new Aberdeen bypass.
Yeah. It has got a name, and I can't remember it.
One of them mentioned it. Is it? Forgive my pronunciation if it's wrong. Peter Coulter.
Well, Peter Coulter, yes, but that's just the name of the local small town where it occurred. It has its own name, like feather something or other, and that's what I can't remember. I'm sorry.
I've got a couple of links here, but
yeah,
don't have time.
Yes, no, I saw them. Yeah.
One question that came in earlier that I was trying to find an appropriate point.
Mill timber, that's it. David Breer says it's mill timber. That's it.
Thanks.
That's the name. 90 ovens. But we haven't found any ditch round this area. And yet the Romans are there doing something.
Yeah.
But as I say, as I would see, they're in control of the landscape.
Yeah. Was there any datable material from there yet? Do you know, or is it just?
There is, but again, my memory is playing me up today.
Okay.
Okay, next. Yeah.
Right, move on. Yeah, the question I was mentioning was from A. Rodwell. Don't have a first name, I'm afraid. Has LiDAR shown any sign of campaign roads or absence suggestive of a very short single season campaign? I'm happy to answer that if you'd rather, but
oh, do carry on.
The short answer is you're unlikely to see any sign on LiDAR of a campaign road.
Yeah.
We have very little evidence of those that were actually created or I hesitate to say constructed because they would have been so light. There's been a lot of theories about this, but not a lot of fact.
Yeah.
So the short answer is, I'm afraid, no, and we're never likely to see them.
Yeah. If they existed.
If they existed,
I mean, interestingly, we do have evidence that when they come to permanent occupation, the roads come after the military structures. So Castle Gregg on the north side of the Pentlands doesn't have any Roman road leading up to it, probably because it had a short life and they didn't get around to constructing the road.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's there are other examples as well.
Yeah.
We have two in Yorkshire. Now we know that Wade's Causeway isn't a Roman road at all.
Oh, isn't it? That's a shame. What about Blackstone Edge then?
Don't get me going on Blackstone Edge. Blackstone Edge was built in the early 18th century. It was the first turnpike road from Rochdale to Halifax.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, that's
there
good
is
to
a
know.
Roman road over Blackstone Edge. It's just not that one.
All right.
It's some distance off to one side. I've forgotten what I was going to say now. Anyway, there's another question come in. I think this is probably the last one, but you never know. From Delwyn Matthews. Concerning the types of pack animals used, I think that Sue Stallybrass has a lot of doubt about mules being much used in Britain. Apparently, there's very little evidence. Yeah, she made this. She mentioned this in a presentation at the Durham conference in March, which I sadly missed.
Yes. It's how you get the evidence. I mean, we must never forget that how little evidence of anything we actually have.
Yes.
You know, can I give you one of my favorite examples? Every year, every unit in the Roman army submitted a report to Rome. So let's say there were 400 units times 400 years. You can work out the maths yourself. How many reports do we have? 6.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're trying to build up a picture of the Roman army on so few documents. Mules, yes, I was there when Sue gave her paper. She was there because I asked her to. I wanted her to because she's brilliant. Having said that, we must accept what she says. Obviously, I'm not, but we have little evidence for cavalry horses. You know, we've got all these cavalry units of 500 men, where there's 12 in Britain. Where are all their horses?
Yes,
very few in comparison to the numbers that once existed. But we are on a European-wide project. We're looking at the question of where the cavalry horses came from, which is another interesting aspect because the ones that have been examined in Germany, some of them actually came from Spain. So the question is, how did they take their horses from Spain to Germany?
Susan Rands is agreeing with Sue. Not many mules in Britain. More suited hotter climates, and she's suggesting that pack ponies will be more likely. As a horseman
Yeah.
myself, I do tend to agree with her. And
Yeah.
certainly the evidence we have from that I know of from post-medieval use of pack animals, they tended to be ponies rather than mules in this country. I don't see why it would have been any different in the Roman period.
Yeah.
But you're not going to get many faunal remains. That's the problem.
Yeah.
So proving any of it is going to be difficult.
Yeah.
I think that is it. If there's any more, Susan, can you send them through? I don't think there are. And anyone's got any more to ask? Be quick.
Well, if nobody's got any more to ask, can I thank your audience, Mike?
You
because
certainly
they've
can.
asked me some very awkward questions. And that's the whole purpose of having an audience, that they challenge the speaker. I'm very grateful to them, and I will be following up the points that they have made. So thank you, everybody, for challenging me and throwing out these very difficult questions and ideas.
We always do have a very good audience. And to be honest, you've broken a record today, or you've set a record. We had at peak 202. Now, that's not quite a record in itself, but after you reach the peak, you never lost one. And that's a
right. Oh, good. Oh,
that's
thank
the
you.
first. So this is our fifth season, and that's never happened before. So well done.
All right. Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
I always lose a couple of dozen, so
right, it's against you.
there's no more questions coming in. So it just remains to thank David again for a fantastic talk, and a stimulating and interesting one as well. And to thank the audience, as Dave's already done. I just want to add that booking for our next talk, which will be John Reed, just trying to remember what his subject is, the archaeology of conflict in Roman Britain. That's on Thursday, the 24th of October. Booking for that will open tomorrow. I should have it done by lunchtime. So hopefully we'll see you all there. Right, so with that, if there's nothing else, it just remains for me to bid everybody good night.